Astronauts are hundreds of kilometers above Earth. Everything is going according to plan. Communication is stable. Pressure is normal. And then, silence. No signal. No confirmation that they're even alive. At mission control, they first assume it's a technical glitch. 1 minute passes, then another, and that's when the realization hits. If the connection doesn't come back, no one can help them. Today, we're breaking down a real incident when NASA lost contact with astronauts, and it became clear that a backup plan might not have existed at all. Moments of silence like this in space are not uncommon, but this time, the situation was different. This was a real mission where contact with the crew wasn't lost for seconds, but for a dangerously long period of time, and what became clear later was far more unsettling. If communication hadn't returned, rescuing the astronauts would have been nearly impossible. In mainstream news, it was labeled a temporary communication issue, a harmless phrase, but it hides what few people talk about. During orbital missions, communication is not just conversation. It is life support monitoring, navigation, orbital corrections, and most importantly, emergency commands, without which a crew is completely on its own. When the signal is lost, mission control becomes effectively blind. They don't know what's happening inside the spacecraft. They don't know if there's an air leak. They don't know if orientation systems are still functioning. And in this particular incident, the problem went beyond communication. The mission occurred at a time when backup channels were already limited. Some systems were under maintenance. Certain emergency protocols were temporarily unavailable. And if events had taken a worse turn, NASA would not have had a simple bring the crew home now option. That's why this incident still raises questions today. Not because something exploded, but because nothing happened, and that was the most frightening part. Before we move on, ask yourself, what's scarier, a disaster, or the moment when you don't even know if one has begun? A loss of communication in space never happens for no reason. Behind every second of silence is a chain of decisions, limitations, and risks that are rarely explained to the public. In this case, everything began during what should have been a routine moment. The spacecraft was passing through a zone where communication was supposed to switch from one ground segment to another. These handovers happen all the time, and almost always unnoticed. But it's precisely during these moments that the system becomes most vulnerable. Contact with the crew was lost abruptly, not gradually, not with interference, but as if someone had simply cut the line. During the first seconds, no one at mission control panics. There are procedures. There are checklists. There is confidence that the signal will return. 30 seconds pass. 1 minute. 90 seconds. And this is when the situation begins to move beyond a routine glitch. The problem is that communication is not a single channel. It's a complex network of antennas, relay satellites, ground stations, and software systems. If the signal doesn't return, it suggests the failure is not isolated to one point. Engineers start checking everything: ground stations, orbital relays, onboard systems, and each new test brings an unsettling conclusion. Earth-based systems are functioning normally, which means only one thing: the issue may be onboard the spacecraft. And this is where the real danger begins. If the communication system fails inside the spacecraft, it could be a software malfunction, overheating, antenna damage, or something far worse, multiple systems failing at once. Under normal conditions, the crew can manually switch to backups. But during this mission, some backup channels were restricted, not permanently disabled, but temporarily unavailable due to the flight configuration. In other words, the astronauts could have been trapped without realizing it. The most dangerous aspect of situations like this is information asymmetry. The crew may assume the issue is on Earth, while Earth assumes the issue is on board, and no one knows who is right. If, at that moment, an air leak begins, or attitude control fails, or temperatures rise, mission controls simply wouldn't know in time. This is why NASA documents include the term loss of crew awareness, a moment when the crew is technically alive, but effectively cut off from the planet supporting them. Communication was lost long enough for emergency scenarios to be considered, but short enough for officials to later say, nothing critical occurred. And that is the core paradox. Because incidents like this never make headlines, they don't look like disasters, yet they reveal just how fragile human life truly is beyond Earth. When communication finally returned, the official explanation was brief and sterile. A technical malfunction, systems restored, no danger to the crew. But between the lines was another truth. If anything had gone wrong during those minutes, no one would have been able to intervene. And that leads to an uncomfortable question. Do we really control space? Or have we simply been lucky that it has tolerated us so far? The most terrifying part of this incident wasn't the loss of communication itself. It was the moment when it became clear that time was almost gone. At a certain point, engineers at Mission Control stop waiting. They begin running worst-case simulations, because if the connection doesn't return within the next few minutes, it means only one thing: the crew is operating blind, or may no longer be able to operate at all. There is no pause in space, no moment to stop and figure things out. If attitude control fails, the spacecraft begins to slowly rotate. If temperatures exceed limits, electronics fail first. If an air leak begins, the countdown isn't hours, it's minutes. And all of this can happen in complete silence. At that moment, Mission Control realizes something else, something rarely said out loud. Even if communication suddenly returns, it may already be too late to intervene. Commands sent from Earth have delay. Decisions made by the crew are irreversible. And mistakes in space are unforgiving. This is where the most frightening scenario emerges. The astronauts are alive. Systems are partially functional, but a chain of small failures has already begun, and it cannot be stopped. At that point, the mission stops being scientific. It becomes a fight for survival in which Earth no longer has control. Later, reports would state that the situation was under control, but that is hindsight language, because real control means the ability to change the outcome. And during those minutes, nothing could be changed. If one more system had failed, if temperatures had risen just slightly higher, if the antenna had suffered physical damage, we would have learned about it only afterward, after everything was over. And perhaps that's why this episode is never discussed in detail, because it reveals an unsettling truth. Sometimes, human life in space is held together not by technology, but by a very narrow margin of luck. And on that day, that margin was dangerously thin. Communication eventually returned. Data reappeared on the monitors. The astronauts' voices came back over the channel. Formally, the incident was resolved. Later reports would state that systems functioned nominally, that there was no threat to life, that the situation remained under control. But there is one detail those reports don't capture. No one was ever able to say with certainty what exactly happened during those minutes of silence. Was it a single malfunction, or the beginning of a chain that simply didn't have time to unfold? Space has no witnesses, no black boxes that always tell the truth, only telemetry, and it shows only what managed to be transmitted. Everything else is speculation. This incident never became a disaster. It didn't make it into textbooks. It isn't remembered on anniversaries. But moments like this are the most unsettling, because they remind us that humanity is still balancing on the edge of what it can truly control. Every launch is a risk. Every orbit is an act of trust in a system that must work without the right to fail. And when that system goes silent, all that remains is waiting. And perhaps the most disturbing question isn't what happened that day, but rather, how many similar moments have already occurred that we never even knew about.